Hi, welcome to the video Spring Global Exception Handler with me, Nam Haming from CodeJava.net. Through this video, I'd like to share with you how to code exception handling per application in Spring Web MVC and Spring REST API applications. In detail, you will learn how to use the controller advised exception handler, response status, and response body annotations for handling exceptions in Spring applications. We used global exception handling to handle exceptions thrown by all controllers in one central place, which is the exception handler class, and we remove the exception handling code that is scattered in different controllers. So what to do in an exception handler? Typically, we can log error, return proper error view or HTTP status code or any custom processing when an exception occurs. Okay, now I'd like to show you how to code a global exception handler for a Spring MVC web application. As you can see, I have a Java Maven project for a web application based on Spring MVC. Here you see in the pom.xml file, I used Spring Data JPA, Timelib, Spring Web, with MySQL database, this is MySQL connector Java, the JDBC driver. Okay, and in this project, I have the product controller class. You see, and in this handler method, show edit product form. You see, the code catches the exception, product not found exception, and if this exception is thrown by the service class here, you see product not found exception. It sets the view name to product not found. That means the application will redirect the user to the product not found page, which is an HTML template here. And similarly, another handler method, delete product, also catches the product not found exception and returns the logical view name product not found in case the exception is thrown by the service class. So you can see the code that handles exception is somewhat repetitive and boilerplate and scatter in these two handler methods. Okay, in the next few minutes, I'll show you how to code an exception handler globally to remove this scattered exception handling code. Now let me start this Spring Boot application to demo the product not found exception. Okay, the application started. Now let me access it in Chrome browser localhost. Here you see this is the home page of the product manager application, and in this application I can edit a product, and somehow I enter an ID which does not exist in the database like this, and you see it shows the product not found page. And similarly for the delete action here, if the product ID does not exist in the database, we should see an error page like this showing user-friendly message. Okay, now let me try another case. I stop my SQL server here, stop the service. Okay, and try delete a product with ID does not exist in the database, but now the database server is stopped. You see, we get the white label error page showing the technical exception details here. It should not display the technical error message like this to the end user. Instead, we should handle the exception and show a user-friendly error page. Now let me start my SQL server again. Okay, you see, this is a user-friendly error message page. Okay, now I'm going to code a global exception handler for this project. So let me create a new Java class here, global exception handler. And for a global exception handler class, we should use the controller advised annotation here. So it will intercept all the handler methods of all controllers in the application for exception handling. And now I add a exception handler method to handle the product not found exception. So I code a new method here, public string handle product not found exception. And for this handler method, you should use the exception handler annotation and specify the exception class to be handled. Okay, so when the product not found exception is thrown by a controller in the application, this exception handler method will be invoked. And in this method, because this is a Spring MVC application, we should return a logical field name, product not found, in case the product not found exception occurs, like this. And more, we want to log the error, so I declare a logger here. Logger equal logger factory. Get logger and the class global exception handler dot class, and in the handler method I log the exception. So in the method signature you can declare a parameter of type exception like this to access the exception object that is thrown, and logger error. Okay, message. Okay, and then in the controller class you can delete the child catch block here. Then the method, the handler method should throw a product not found exception, you see. Okay, delete child catch block here. So you can see by using a global exception handler, we can remove the boilerplate, the repetitive exception handling code in handler methods in controller. We need to add throws for the handler method here to throw the product not found exception. Okay. Now let me test again. Okay. Now access try to delete, and I see the product not found page here, and in the console view you can see it prints the product not found exception, which structure is this is the result of the logger statement here, logger.error here. Okay, so I hope it makes sense to you. You need to create a class annotated with the controller advised annotation, and to handle a specific exception, you need to code a handler method like this using the exception handler annotation to specify the exception you want to handle. Now let me add another exception handler method to handle another exception. So I start by using the exception handler annotation and specify the exception class for the error that database server is not running. We can handle the JDBC connection exception like this. Public. Now this exception handler method I return a model and view object instead of a string. A handle db connection error. And now instead of returning a logical view name or with a string, I can return a model and view object just like in this handler method. So I copy this statement. Okay, model and view, and specify the view name is connection error, and return the model and view object. Okay, and then I need to create another HTML page. So I copy and paste and modify here. Set the file name should be connection error. Okay, and I change the text here. Error connecting to database server, for example. Okay, now let me test the case that the database is not running. Okay, refresh the application here. Okay, now I stop my SQL Server. Stop. Okay, now refresh. You see, we got the error page, error connecting to database server. This is more user-friendly than the technical exception page as you saw before. So that means the exception handling code in this method is invoked, you see. So that's how to handle another exception case. Okay, so far so good. Now let me start my SQL Server. Start. And typically in a global exception handler class, you should have a exception handler method that handles the zero exception to cast other exceptions. So I use the exception handler annotation and specify the exception class. This is a base exception class for all exceptions. Public string handle zero error or zero exception. And I simply return a view name zero error. And I create a new new HTML file for this view. Copy, paste here, zero error. And change the message here. Sorry, there was an error occur on the server. For example, something like that. Okay, now let me test this exception handler method. To do so, I modify the table column, change the column name in this table. Change the name column here, name 1. Apply. And now refresh the application here. And you see, now I got another error message. Sorry, there was an error occur on the server. That means the exception handler method here got invoked. Okay, now let me change the column name back. And now the application should be working. Refresh. You see, it is working normally. Next, I'd like to show you how to code a global exception handler for Spring REST API application. As you can see, I have another project which is for file upload and download REST API. You see, and this is the file download controller class that implements the file download API endpoint. You see, it calls the download UT class, which can throw IO exception here. And this is a file upload controller class that implements the file upload API. You see, the handler method also throws IO exception. Now let me start this Spring Boot application to test the file upload API in Postman program here. Okay, now I enter the request URL. Okay, and if I click the send button here, you see, because I specify the HTTP method is get, but in the API it requires the method is post, so I will get an exception, an error. You see, the error is method not allowed, and the exception is HTTP request method not found, not supported exception here. Okay, this is a default error JSON response generated by Spring. You see, the message is request method get not supported, and I want to customize this JSON error to provide a more user-friendly error message. I don't want to expose the technical details here. Okay, so come back to the project and I create a new class for handling the exceptions globally. Global exception handler. And we also need to use the controller advanced annotation for this global exception handler class. And the first error I want to handle is the HTTP request method not supported exception. So I use the exception handler class, handler annotation, and specifies the exception class is HTTP request method not supported exception, not class. Public string handle method not supported. For early testing, I just return a simple message here. Method not supported. Okay, and test. Okay, now I click the send button here. Let me check. Also, we should use the annotation response status to specify the HTTP status code. For example, for this exception, the status code is HTTP status method not allowed. And also, we need to use the response body annotation to response body to tell Spring to include the return value in the method in the body of the response. Okay, now test again. Click send. And you see now I got a simple text response HTTP method not supported. And you can see the status HTTP status is for file method not allowed in the response here. Okay, let me update the code. Now I want to return a JSON document. I create a new class here. Error info. And in this error info class, I want to have two fields. The first one is URL of the request. The second one is the message. Okay, and generate getters and setters, and generate some constructors. Generate constructor using fields. And I want to have another constructor that takes different types of parameters. This, this should be HTTP server request and set the URL to get request URL to string. And the second parameter, I want it to be an exception object and get the message of the exception. Okay, and then update the return type of the exception handler method here in the global exception handler class. So instead of returning a string, I return an error info object. And also update the method signature to include HTTP server request. If you want, you can also access the HTTP server response object and the exception object. Okay, now I return a new error info object passing the request and the exception. Okay, now test again. Okay, click send. And you see now in the body response, I get a JSON document with two fields, URL and message here. Request method get not supported. This is a message of the exception. Very cool, right? Now I change the method here to post, but I don't specify the file to be uploaded in the body. Click send. And you see I got internet server error status firewall. This is also another exception I should handle. You see the exception class is multipath exception. So I code another exception handler method here using the exception handler annotation and then the class name multipath exception in this case and response status. I don't want to use internet server error status there. I want to use another status, for example, bad request and response body. Okay, and I can copy the code of the previous method, change the name to handle multipath exception. I need to change the class HTTP, sorry, multipath exception. Okay. And I also want to customize the message here. So I pass a message here. I create another constructor. This should be string message. Okay, and I pass my custom message here. For example, invalid upload request. Okay, and test again. Now click send. And you see, I got the status for all part request and the response here with the message invalid file upload request. Perfect. Now let me specify a file to be uploaded in the body of the request. So I choose form data and the key name is file and choose the type is file and select a file. I select an image and click send. And you see now I got another error, internet server error, IO exception, error saving uploaded file. This is the result of the exception thrown by the file upload empty class here, error saving uploaded file, because the upload directory files upload does not exist. So I also want to handle this kind of exception. So I copy, paste, and code another exception handler method here. Now the exception type is IO exception, and the status is internet server error. Handle IO exception, and I pass the message of the exception. Okay, and test. Okay, now I click send again, and you see now I got JSON response, and the error is internet server error as a response JSON here, error saving uploaded file. Alright, so far you have learned how to code global exception handler in Spring applications. Now let me sum up the key points. So to handle the exceptions globally, you need to create a new separate class annotated with the controller advised annotation. And for each type of exception to be handled, you need to code a separate handler method like this using the exception handler annotation and specify the exception class to be handled. And the code in the handler method will be invoked if the exception occurs. And for Spring Web MVC application, you can return a model and view object from the exception handler method and access the exception object from the method argument like this. And you can also catch handle multiple exceptions using an array of exceptions like this. And you can also access HTTP service request, HTTP service response, and exception via method arguments like this. And for Spring Web MVC, you can also return a logical view name from the exception handler method like this. And for Spring REST API, you need to use the response status to specify the HTTP status and response body to tell Spring include the return value of the handler method in the body of the response. And you can also specify multiple exceptions in one handler method like this. And you can access HTTP service request, HTTP service response, and exception, and return the custom class, for example, error info here. I hope you found this video helpful. Please subscribe to my channel, like, comment, and share this video. Thanks for watching.